I never expected my roommate's girlfriend to invade our apartment. Blurred boundaries, subtle intrusions, and my carefully planned routines were suddenly at risk. I'm a 20-year-old student, and I share an apartment with a guy, just a friend. I know it sounds unusual to some, but for both of us, it made perfect sense financially. Splitting rent, utilities, and groceries meant we could live in a decent place without going broke, and we both appreciated the independence. From the very beginning, we established clear rules about personal space. No overnight guests without discussion. Each of us had our own study area and bedroom, and common areas were shared with respect and tidiness in mind that it's important to emphasize. There's never been anything romantic between us. People often assume living with the opposite sex automatically means tension or attraction, but we've proven it can work when boundaries are clear. We both value our independence, and our arrangement allows that without complications. He has his routines, I have mine, and the apartment functions like a well-oiled machine most of the time that I'm extremely focused on my studies and part-time job. My course load is intense, and I've chosen a path that could open doors to a promising future, so distractions are unwelcome. I also don't seek extra attention from men. Flirty behavior or unwanted advances make me uncomfortable, and I prefer to stay focused on the goals I've set for myself. This living setup supports that. I can study, work, and rest without interruption, and it's a relief knowing the apartment will stay a neutral, calm space that on workdays, the contrast is especially clear. After long shifts, exhausted and craving quiet, I can come home and immediately dive into homework or unwind. I have my favorite spots. My desk where my textbooks and laptop are arranged just the way I like. The corner of the couch with a soft blanket where I can read or watch a video in peace, and the kitchen where I can make coffee without anyone barging in or cluttering the counters. Even small details matter. I like my pens lined up, my notes stacked neatly, the apartment smelling faintly of the candle I keep lit in the evenings. These routines give me comfort and a sense of control, and yet, despite all the planning, I know that life has a way of shaking the neatest arrangements. Even the best laid boundaries can be tested, and I've learned that no matter how perfect a system seems, it can change in an instant. But for now, everything was calm, predictable, and entirely mine. The apartment was a sanctuary, a place where I could be entirely myself, focused, organized, and in control of my own space. I treasured that stability. Little did I know, the balance I had so carefully maintained was about to be challenged in ways I hadn't anticipated, and my patience and assertiveness would soon be tested more than ever before. My daily life revolves around structure. I wake up early to study before my part-time shifts, organize my schedule meticulously, and keep a detailed calendar of deadlines, assignments, and work hours. Even small things matter. The angle of my desk lamp, whether my notebooks are color-coded, and the exact order I tackle tasks in. This precision isn't about being controlling. It's about survival and future opportunities. My career path is competitive, and any slip in focus could set me back significantly. I also take my part-time job seriously. It's not a daily gig, but the days I work are exhausting, filled with errands, customer interactions, and mental strain. On those days, I cherish the apartment as my personal refuge. The contrast is stark when I return home after a long shift. The apartment's quiet corners feel like a haven, and any disruption is magnified. A misplaced textbook or loud conversation becomes glaring because it interrupts the delicate balance I need to recover. Part of my personality is that I avoid unnecessary attention from men. I'm not cold, but I'm focused. Flirtation, casual. Advances or lingering attention are unwelcome distractions. The platonic roommate arrangement suits me perfectly because it eliminates those dynamics entirely. I can focus on my studies and work, maintain my independence, and live without the constant pressure of social expectations. Even though I'm serious about my routines, I try to be considerate. I keep common areas tidy, help with chores, and respect my roommate's space. We have a silent understanding. My corner is respected, his corner is respected, and the shared space is neutral territory. It works because we both honor it consistently. I also notice subtle things about my environment that others might overlook. The scent of my favorite coffee in the morning, the soft hum of the fridge, the way sunlight hits the kitchen counter in the afternoon. These small sensory details anchor me. They create a mental and emotional environment where I can think clearly, plan efficiently, and decompress after stressful days. Disruptions to this routine aren't just inconvenient. They feel invasive, like my personal sanctuary is being encroached upon. This focus and dedication aren't just quirks, they're survival tools. I've learned early that protecting my mental space is crucial for achieving long-term goals. And while friends and social connections matter, they never take priority over the foundation I've built for myself. The apartment isn't just a living space, it's a stage for my growth, where discipline and structure shape my path forward. Now, everything is functioning perfectly, and I feel in control. But I know from experience that even the best laid plans can be tested. The routines, the quiet, and the boundaries are delicate, and soon, something unexpected will challenge them, pushing me to assert myself in ways I haven't had to before. The first few months of living together, the arrangement worked perfectly. Our schedules aligned in a way that minimized conflict. I spent my mornings and afternoons studying or working part-time, while he had his own routines that rarely overlapped with mine in a disruptive way. The apartment felt calm and organized, each of us respecting the boundaries we had set from day one. That we had an unspoken rhythm. I would brew my coffee, light a candle, and settle into my study corner while he occupied the living room with his hobbies or video games. If either of us needed quiet, it was understood and immediately respected. Even our shared kitchen functioned smoothly. I had my favorite mugs and utensils, and he had his. There was no confusion over space or ownership because we communicated clearly from the start. On weekends, the apartment would hum with a relaxed energy. I could focus on longer study sessions, while he entertained friends or indulged in his hobbies in the living room. We had agreed that common areas could be used freely, as long as they were cleaned up afterward. This prevented any lingering tension or resentment. Small gestures mattered. He would occasionally pick up groceries if I was too busy, and I would run quick errands for him. These acts reinforced mutual respect without complicating our platonic dynamic. The harmony extended beyond physical space. There was a sense of trust and predictability that made daily life feel safe. I could leave personal items on my desk without worrying about them being moved, and he could use his space without interference. Even the quiet evenings were enjoyable. I would read a book or watch a tutorial while he played music softly. In the background, our coexistence seamless. On days when I worked part-time, the contrast in the apartment was noticeable but not intrusive. I knew I could return home to a space that felt entirely mine, a sanctuary for studying, resting, or just being alone without interruption. It was this predictability that made the apartment feel like a true home, and I valued it immensely. Even our conversations were thoughtful and considerate. If I mentioned needing quiet to focus or extra time for studying, it was respected. Similarly, he would let me know when he had friends over or needed the common areas, ensuring that neither of us felt blindsided. This balance, rare in shared living arrangements, created a foundation of trust and comfort that allowed both of us to thrive. For a while, life was steady. The apartment was a reflection of our personalities, orderly, structured, and mutually respectful. I could focus entirely on my studies, my part-time job, and the career I was building without constant distractions or stress. It felt like a perfect equilibrium, one I thought could last indefinitely, until small, subtle changes began to unsettle it. The first hints that something was changing were almost imperceptible. His girlfriend started spending a little more time at the apartment. Nothing alarming at first, just an extra evening or a weekend visit. At first, I didn't mind. After all, I was focused on work and studies, and a few extra people around. The apartment seemed manageable. But then, little things began to shift, and I noticed her moving around the space more confidently than expected, sitting on the couch where I usually read, and leaving her belongings casually scattered in common areas. It wasn't intentional sabotage, but it was enough to unsettle the balance we had built. On days when I returned from work, tired and craving solitude, the subtle intrusion of someone else's presence was magnified. My sanctuary felt slightly less mine, even though everything technically belonged to us equally. "Hey, could you move your bag? I need the table for my notes," I said one evening, trying to keep my tone calm. "Oh, sorry. I didn't realize," she replied, hopping up and giving me a quick, distracted smile before going back to scrolling on her phone. The interaction was polite, almost casual, but the feeling lingered. She didn't mean to overstep, but the balance of our apartment, the rhythm I relied on, had been nudged. Every small sound of her moving around, the smell of her coffee, or the soft hum of her headphones in the living room chipped away at the quiet, organized environment I depended on. Even on my part-time workdays, when I was physically away, the mental picture of the apartment being calm began to feel less reliable. I started noticing that returning home, even for a short study session, was no longer entirely peaceful. It wasn't dramatic yet, but the first seeds of tension had been planted that I reminded myself that the rules existed for a reason: personal space, quiet hours, and clear boundaries, and that if this continued, I would need to assert myself more strongly. But for now, I tried to adapt, telling myself that a few extra visits weren't the end of the world. Still, a nagging thought kept creeping in. If the pattern continued, my carefully structured environment could be disrupted in ways I wasn't ready to handle. And that thought made me pay closer attention, noticing details I might have ignored before. The placement of her shoes, the way she used the kitchen, even how she leaned casually in spaces that had always felt exclusively. Mine at IT was a small, almost invisible imbalance, but I could feel it growing. And deep down, I knew that without addressing it, the apartment might no longer be the sanctuary I depended on. The contrast between my workdays and the apartment's routine became increasingly obvious. On days when I worked my part-time job, I was drained physically and mentally, and I craved the quiet and structure that my home always provided. But lately, returning home felt different. The subtle invasion of her presence, her belongings left casually around, the faint sound of her music or conversation, made the apartment feel less like my refuge and more like a space temporarily occupied by someone else. That IT wasn't aggressive or hostile, just the natural consequence of her being there more frequently. Still, it created a subtle tension that grew with each passing week. I noticed it most when I tried to settle into my study corner. My desk, usually neat and comforting, would have a random notebook or jacket on it. My usual spot on the couch was occupied, forcing me to find an alternative that never felt quite right. "Could you maybe keep the living room clear tonight? I have a big assignment due," I asked once, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Oh, yeah, totally, no problem," she said, moving to the kitchen. But instead of leaving the apartment quiet, she lingered, in her own way, humming a song and occasionally checking her phone. Her presence wasn't malicious, but the subtle disruption was noticeable, especially on days when I was already exhausted. These small tensions began affecting my focus. Normally, I could lose myself in study for hours without interruption, but now I found myself distracted by noise, movement, or even just the thought that someone else was occupying the space I considered mine. My routines, which had been carefully calibrated, were being chipped away piece by piece. Even my roommate's awareness wasn't enough to counter the effect. He had good intentions, but the apartment's new dynamic, influenced by his girlfriend's presence, created a subtle but constant pressure. I realized that the comfort and control I had taken for granted weren't permanent. They required maintenance, boundaries, and occasionally, direct intervention. On these days, I also reflected on why this arrangement had worked so well before. The boundaries weren't just rules, they were essential for my mental focus and emotional stability. I couldn't let them slide. And while I valued the friendship with my roommate, I recognized that asserting my space was non-negotiable. This tension, though minor, was the first real indication that the apartment, my carefully maintained sanctuary, was at risk of losing its balance. The thought was frustrating, but it also sparked determination. I knew I would need to navigate the situation carefully, protecting both my space and my peace of mind. Over the next few weeks, the minor intrusions became harder to ignore. What had started as small, occasional disruptions slowly grew into noticeable annoyances. Her belongings weren't just occasionally on the couch or table anymore. Jackets, bags, and even some of her books were appearing in my study area. I'd come home from a long day at work to find my carefully arranged desk partially occupied, my textbooks slightly askew, and my pen scattered. "Hey, could you not leave your stuff here? I really need this space to work," I said one evening. Trying to keep calm, but feeling the frustration bubbling. "Ah, sorry. I'll move it," she replied. But instead of disappearing, she lingered, chatting with my roommate about plans for the weekend. Her voice, the casual way she leaned over the counter, and the faint smell of her coffee made the apartment feel less like my sanctuary that I realized that these weren't intentional attempts to bother me. She wasn't trying to disrespect my space, but the sheer frequency and casual confidence with which she occupied the apartment made it harder for me to feel in control. Even when I reminded myself that the arrangement wasn't malicious, it was impossible to ignore the creeping tension. On days I worked my part-time job, the difference was stark. I'd come home exhausted, only to find that the space I relied on for study and focus felt temporarily lost to someone else's presence. My corner of the couch, the desk, even the kitchen, all these areas had subtly shifted in ownership. The apartment, once predictable and serene, now felt dynamic in a way that was stressful that I started noticing little details that I hadn't paid attention to before. The soft hum of her music filling the background, the way she leaned against the furniture as if it were hers. Even the way my roommate seemed slightly more relaxed about these changes than I was. Every intrusion, though small, added up. It wasn't dramatic, but the accumulation of these minor annoyances created a constant undercurrent of tension. I realized that if I didn't address it soon, the balance I had relied on, the predictability, the sanctuary, the focus-friendly environment, could be lost entirely. For the first time, I felt a need to actively protect my space rather than passively expect it to remain undisturbed. It was a subtle shift in mindset, but one that would soon become critical for maintaining my peace, my focus, and my sense of home. I tried to be subtle at first. I didn't want to start any conflict or make anyone feel unwelcome, so I relied on small hints to reclaim my space. I'd gently move her things back to her corner, adjust the desk setup, or lightly comment on the noise. My roommate seemed aware of the tension, but for some reason, these signals weren't enough. "Could you maybe keep the living room quiet for a bit? I have an assignment I need to finish," I said one evening, my voice polite but firm. "Oh, sure, I didn't notice." "No problem," she replied, moving slightly but still lingering. Scrolling on her phone and occasionally humming to herself, I noticed that even when I did manage to physically reclaim my space, the subtle atmosphere had shifted. The apartment didn't feel as serene, and the mental edge I usually had while studying or preparing for work was dulled by her mere presence. The contrast between my work-focused days and my home life became glaringly obvious. Even the smallest gestures, a jacket left on my chair, her mug on my desk, the soft thump of her footsteps in the hall, began to feel like infringements. I reminded myself that she didn't intend any harm, but I also realized that subtle hints weren't enough to preserve my sanctuary. I tried to adapt, rearranging my study corner, putting headphones on, working at odd hours, anything to create a buffer. But the balance that had defined the apartment from day one was slowly unraveling. My roommate seemed caught between not wanting to upset anyone and maintaining the previous harmony. He'd glance at me when she left things out, but rarely intervened. I understood. It wasn't entirely his fault, but it left me in a position where I had to consider taking stronger steps to protect my space. It was frustrating. I prided myself on being patient and measured, but I could feel my tolerance thinning. The apartment had always been a reflection of my need for order and focus, and now I had to confront the uncomfortable reality. Subtlety alone wasn't going to work. I had to decide how to assert my boundaries without creating unnecessary conflict. For the first time, I felt the necessity of a more direct approach. If I didn't act, the environment I depended on, my carefully maintained sanctuary, could continue to slip away under the weight of good intentions and casual oversights. By this point, I could no longer pretend that the situation was minor or temporary. The apartment, my carefully maintained sanctuary, had shifted enough that I felt constant tension whenever I entered. The subtle annoyances, the casual occupation of my space, and the intrusion on my routines could no longer be ignored. I realized that I had to recognize the problem for what it was: a genuine conflict over boundaries and personal space. It wasn't about malice or ill intent. She wasn't deliberately trying to disrupt my life, but her presence and habits were impacting my focus, my comfort, and my sense of ownership over my own home. Every time I came back from work, Returning to a disrupted study corner or a shared space cluttered with someone else's things, it chipped away at the control I relied on for both my mental and emotional stability. I spent a few evenings quietly analyzing the situation. I reflected on my routines, the apartment's balance, and the boundaries we had originally agreed upon. It became painfully clear that subtle hints had failed. My patience, careful reminders, and rearrangements were no longer enough. I needed to assert myself more directly to reclaim the space I depended on. Even my roommate, who had always been considerate, seemed unaware of the extent to which the balance had shifted. He didn't see the small but cumulative disruptions that affected my daily life. It wasn't anyone's fault, but it was undeniable. Something had to change. The recognition of conflict came with a mix of frustration and determination. I valued the friendship and the living arrangement, but I also understood that my personal space and routines weren't negotiable. I needed to act, not aggressively, but decisively, to restore the equilibrium that had made this apartment feel like a true sanctuary. It was also a moment of reflection. I realized that boundaries, no matter how well-defined initially, require constant vigilance. Respect is not automatic. It must be reinforced and communicated clearly. Accepting that the conflict existed was the first step toward regaining control and ensuring that my environment continued to support my studies, work, and overall well-being. For the first time, I consciously prepared myself to have a direct conversation with my roommate, understanding that this step was necessary to maintain the balance I had worked so hard to establish. The tension had become real, undeniable, and unavoidable, and now it was time to face it. I knew subtlety wasn't working anymore, so I decided it was time to be direct. I waited for a moment when my roommate was alone with me in the living room, and I took a deep breath. My voice was calm but firm. "Hey, we need to talk about the apartment," I began. "I feel like my personal space is being invaded lately, and it's affecting my ability to focus on work and study." He looked surprised, but nodded. "I didn't realize it was that bad," he said, genuinely concerned. That I explained as clearly as I could how her belongings in my study area, the use of common spaces without consideration, and the general shift in rhythm were making it hard for me to maintain my routines. I emphasized that I understood she wasn't doing it maliciously. It was about protecting my focus and mental space. He listened quietly, then said, "I get it. I think I underestimated how much it affects you." We discussed specific examples: the desk being cluttered, the couch being occupied when I needed it, and the noise levels during my study hours. I suggested practical solutions. She could designate a corner of the living room as her own area, keep her belongings contained, and avoid lingering in my study space. "I just need my space to be respected," I said. "It's not about anyone being unwelcome. It's about maintaining the environment that lets me focus." He agreed, promising to communicate more clearly with her and help enforce the boundaries. There was a weight lifted after that conversation. Just having the issues acknowledged made the apartment feel manageable again. It wasn't perfect yet, and I knew it would take some time for habits to adjust, but the direct confrontation had created clarity. For the first time in weeks, I felt like my routines could be respected again, and the sanctuary I relied on for my studies and work could be restored. The lesson was clear. Subtle hints were ineffective. Being direct, honest, and respectful about boundaries was the only way to maintain balance in a shared living situation, especially when personal space and focus are non-negotiable. After the conversation with my roommate, things started to shift slowly but noticeably. He began actively reminding his girlfriend about the boundaries we had discussed, and she, in turn, made an effort to respect the designated spaces. The subtle tension that had been creeping through the apartment began to fade, replaced with a renewed sense of structure. I noticed small improvements immediately. My desk was clear when I returned from work. My study corner remained undisturbed, and the couch was available for me to relax and read without interruption. Even the kitchen felt orderly again, as though the apartment itself exhaled a sigh of relief. The rhythm I had relied on for months was returning, and I could feel my mental focus sharpening. On days when I worked part-time, the contrast was now positive rather than stressful. Coming home after a long shift, I was met with calm, clean spaces and a cooperative environment. The apartment once again felt like my sanctuary. a place where I could recharge, study, and plan for the future without the constant mental friction I had endured before. We also developed small routines to maintain the balance. Clear communication became essential. If someone needed to use a space I relied on, we would let each other know ahead of time. Shared chores and responsibilities were reinforced, ensuring that both of us felt the apartment was equally respected. Even minor gestures, like moving personal items back to their designated corners, became part of the daily rhythm, keeping the peace intact. This experience taught me the importance of direct communication in shared living situations. Boundaries, no matter how clearly set initially, require maintenance and assertiveness. I realized that it wasn't about being controlling or unfriendly. It was about protecting my focus, my well-being, and the environment that allowed me to thrive at while restoring the balance. I regained not only my personal space, but also a sense of control over my life. The apartment, once again, became a reflection of my priorities, a structured, peaceful, and respectful home where I could continue to study, work, and grow without unnecessary distractions. That I learned that living with others, even in a platonic setup, can be harmonious as long as boundaries are clear, communication is honest, and respect is mutual. The subtle disruptions that had once threatened my sanctuary were now managed, and the apartment felt like a place where I could focus on my future with confidence. Looking back on the past few months, I realized how delicate shared living arrangements can be. The initial harmony, which I once took for granted, depended on clear boundaries, mutual respect, and consistent communication. Once subtle intrusions began, even unintentional ones, they had the power to erode months of stability almost imperceptibly. I also reflected on my own role in the situation. My preference for quiet and structured routines made me sensitive to even minor disturbances, but I recognized that my sensitivity was rooted in genuine needs, my studies, my part-time work, and my personal growth. It wasn't about being difficult. It was about protecting the environment that allowed me to thrive. The experience taught me the importance of assertiveness. Subtle hints and passive adjustments weren't enough to maintain the balance I needed. It took a direct, honest conversation to clarify boundaries and ensure that my personal space was respected. I learned that being polite and considerate doesn't mean sacrificing your well-being. It means communicating clearly and holding firm when necessary. Another important takeaway was about flexibility. While boundaries were non-negotiable, I also recognized the value of compromise. Living with others, even as friends, requires negotiation and empathy. I had to be patient as habits adjusted, and I had to acknowledge the efforts of others to respect the space. This balance of assertiveness and empathy is what ultimately restored harmony. That I also realized that my sanctuary, the apartment, was more than just a physical space. It was a reflection of my priorities, my discipline, and my dedication to my goals. Maintaining it required vigilance, communication, and occasional confrontation. Protecting it wasn't selfish. It was necessary for my growth. Finally, I recognize that boundaries and respect don't just apply to shared spaces. They're lessons that extend into every relationship and collaboration in life. Clear communication, mutual respect, and the courage to assert one's needs are essential skills, whether in friendships, work, or romantic relationships. Looking at the apartment now, I feel a sense of accomplishment. It's not just tidy or quiet. It's a space that allows me to focus, recharge, and progress toward my future. The lessons I've learned about communication, assertiveness, and respect will stay with me far beyond this shared living arrangement.